June 19th, 1944. Commander Takeo Shibata pressed his binoculars against his face with hands that had stopped trembling months ago, not from courage, but from the exhausted acceptance that came with watching an empire die. From the bridge of the carrier Zuikaku, positioned 300 miles west of Saipan in the Philippine Sea, he conducted the ritual that had become his recurring nightmare. Count the enemy carriers. The morning reconnaissance reports had identified them clearly. Task Force 58, Admiral Mitcher's fleet. He began with the forward group. 1, 2, 3, 4 massive fleet carriers, their flight decks alive with aircraft preparing for launch. He shifted his view to the northern group. 5, 6, 7, more of the same class, each capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft. The southern group yielded another 4. 11 total. His hand moved to record the number in his log, then froze. There were more. The reserve group, positioned, further east. 8 Essex-class carriers, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even at this distance. 12, 13, 14, 15 fleet carriers total, plus the light carriers he could now distinguish in the screening forces. The final count went into his log with mechanical precision. 15 large fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, 24 aircraft carriers total. He set down his binoculars and allowed himself to voice the question that had haunted Japanese naval headquarters since the previous autumn. Where did they all come from? The strategic calculations that had driven Japan to war were precise. In December 1941, American carrier strength in the Pacific had been easily quantified. 3 fleet carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. The intelligence had been verified multiple times. The calculations had been clear. Japan possessed 6 large fleet carriers and 7 light carriers at the war's opening. Numerical superiority, qualitative, advantage in aircrew training. The path to victory had seemed direct. Eliminate the American carriers in a decisive battle. Seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. Establish a defensive perimeter the Americans would find too costly to breach. Negotiate a favorable peace. The first phase had proceeded almost exactly as planned, except for one critical detail. The 3 American carriers had not been at Pearl Harbor. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese naval staff had developed contingency plans. 3 American carriers could be handled, 4 at most, if they rushed additional carriers from the Atlantic Fleet. The mathematics of attrition favored Japan. Each carrier lost would take the Americans 3 to 4 years to replace, based on pre-war construction schedules. USS Yorktown had required 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. USS Enterprise, 3.5 years. USS Hornet, commissioned just weeks before Pearl Harbor, had taken nearly 4 years to build. Even accounting for wartime urgency, American carriers would arrive slowly, perhaps 1 per year, 2 at the absolute maximum. Japanese naval doctrine had been built around this arithmetic. Accept losses. Trade carriers, if necessary. The Americans could not replace them faster than Japanese shipyards could deliver new hulls. The decisive battle would come in 1943 or early 1944, when American offensive operations finally brought their remaining carriers within range of the combined fleet. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 had validated these assumptions. The Americans lost Lexington. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho. More importantly, Shokaku suffered heavy damage and Zuikaku lost most of her air group, a tactical victory for Japan, despite the loss. 2 American carriers neutralized, 1 permanently. The attrition rate remained favorable. Then came Midway, June 4th through 7th, 1942, the engagement that Japanese planners had sought, but under circumstances they had not anticipated. Admiral Yamamoto's plan had been elegant. Lure the remaining American carriers into a trap near Midway Island, sink them, establish dominance that would persist for years while American shipyards slowly rebuilt. The execution had been flawed in ways that would be analyzed for decades. The critical moment came shortly after 10:22 in the morning on June 4th. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, arriving at the precise instant when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, caught Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with their flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. Within 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were burning. The fourth, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that severely damaged Yorktown before. American aircraft found and destroyed her as well. By June 7th, when surviving Japanese forces retreated westward, the calculus of the Pacific War had fundamentally changed. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers. All 4 had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. Akagi, flagship of the carrier striking force. Kaga, the converted battleship that had served since 1928. Soryu and Hiryu, the purpose-built carriers that represented the cutting edge of Japanese carrier design. More critically, Japan had lost approximately 110 trained aircrew, 25% of the embarked air groups on those 4 carriers. Not crippling to the Japanese Naval Air Corps as a whole, the Navy had possessed 2,000 carrier-qualified aircrews at the war's start, but the loss of experienced squadron leaders and veteran pilots could not be replaced through training programs that required 2 years to produce a competent carrier pilot. The Americans had lost Yorktown, 1 carrier for 4. The exchange rate had catastrophically favored the United States. Still, the strategic situation remained theoretically manageable. Japan retained a significant carrier force, Zuikaku and Shokaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, both operational after repairs. The light carriers Ryujo, Zuiho, Zunyo, and Hio. New carriers under construction. The decisive battle concept remained viable if Japanese naval aviation could be rebuilt and concentrated for one final, overwhelming strike. What changed was not Japanese capabilities. What changed was American production. The first indication came in August 1943. American forces launched Operation Galvanic, the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. Japanese reconnaissance identified the supporting carrier force. 2 pre-war carriers, Enterprise and Saratoga, both veterans of the early Pacific campaigns, expected, accounted for in Japanese planning, and 4 carriers that had not existed at Midway, USS Essex, USS Yorktown, USS Lexington, USS Bunker Hill. Large fleet carriers, each displacing over 30,000 tons, each carrying air groups of 80 to 90 aircraft, purpose-built for extended Pacific operations, all commissioned within the previous 9 months. The intelligence reports went to Admiral Koga Mineichi, who had replaced Yamamoto after the latter's death in April. His staff officers conducted the analysis with growing confusion. American carriers had always required 3 to 4 years to build. These new ships had been commissioned in approximately 20 months from keel laying to sea trials. USS Franklin, the reports soon indicated, had been built in 14 months. 14 months from cutting steel to full operational status. The figure defied everything Japanese naval intelligence understood about American shipbuilding capacity. More confusing still was the continuity of their arrival. October 1943. USS Intrepid commissioned. December. USS Hornet. January 1944. USS Wasp. February. USS Hancock. The pattern became unmistakable. The Americans were commissioning 1 large fleet carrier every 2 months. Japanese naval intelligence scrambled to update their projections. If the Americans maintained this production rate, which seemed physically impossible but was apparently happening, they would possess 20 fleet carriers by mid-1944. The number seemed absurd. Capital ships did not appear with such speed. Battleships took 3 to 4 years to construct. Large carriers required similar timeframes due to the complexity of their machinery, aviation systems, and armor protection. Yet, the evidence was irrefutable. Each new carrier that appeared in American task forces bore the distinctive characteristics of the Essex-class. The same general design, the same dimensions, the same capabilities. Mass production of a standardized design, executed with industrial efficiency that Japanese planners had never conceived possible. The strategic implications cascaded through every level of Japanese naval planning. The decisive battle concept, which had driven Japanese carrier doctrine since the 1920s, assumed rough parity in carrier numbers at the point of engagement. 4 or 5 Japanese carriers, backed by land-based air power, engaging 3 or 4 American carriers in waters chosen by Japan. Attrition would favor the defenders. Victory would establish a strategic balance that could be sustained. That balance no longer existed. By spring 1944, as American forces prepared to assault the Mariana Islands, Japanese naval intelligence had identified 14 Essex-class carriers in various stages of operational deployment. 14, plus the pre-war carriers Enterprise and Saratoga, plus 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, each carrying approximately 30 aircraft. 25 American carriers operational, with more appearing every month. Japan, by contrast, had managed to complete exactly 1 purpose-built fleet carrier since Midway. Taiho, commissioned March 7, 1944, 29,300 tons displacement, capable of carrying 63 aircraft plus spares, the finest carrier Japan had ever produced, incorporating lessons from 2 years of combat. 1 carrier. In 22 months, the American industrial advantage was not simply quantitative, it was existential. For every carrier Japan could place into service, the Americans deployed 6. For every month Japan required to build a carrier, the Americans needed less than 3 weeks per hull when production was fully distributed across multiple shipyards. The most damning analysis came from Commander Nakajima Tadashi, attached to the Naval General Staff's Strategic Planning section. His report, submitted in April 1944 and immediately classified, concluded that American carrier production represented something fundamentally different from traditional naval construction. The Americans had applied mass production techniques, developed in automobile factories and aircraft plants, to capital ship construction. Each Essex-class hull was built from standardized components fabricated simultaneously across multiple facilities. The flight deck, hangar deck, engineering spaces, and weapons systems were constructed as separate modules, then assembled in a fraction of the time traditional shipbuilding required. More critically, the Americans had solved the workforce bottleneck. Women comprised 35% of the workforce at Waterfleet Arsenal and presumably similar percentages at the carrier shipyards. Workers operated in 3 shifts, 7 days per week. The production lines never stopped. The result was a manufacturing capability that Japan could not match even theoretically. Japanese shipyards, already strained by the need to repair battle damage, produce destroyers and submarines and maintain the merchant fleet, simply lacked the physical capacity to build carriers at 1/10 the American rate. Naval architects reviewing the Essex-class specifications identified another advantage that went beyond simple numbers. The Essex design prioritized damage survivability through extensive compartmentalization and redundant systems. Fuel systems were designed to minimize fire risk. Multiple damage control stations ensured that a single hit would not cripple the entire vessel. American carrier doctrine reflected this robust design philosophy. Essex-class carriers could absorb punishment that would sink lighter Japanese carriers and remain operational. USS Franklin would later demonstrate this dramatically when she survived 2 direct bomb hits and a devastating fire that killed over 700 men. The ship not only remained afloat but returned to Pearl Harbor under her own power. Japanese carriers, optimized for striking power rather than survivability, lacked this resilience. Unarmored flight decks maximized aircraft capacity, but meant that a single bomb penetrating to the hangar deck could trigger catastrophic fires. Fuel systems, designed in the 1930s before combat experience revealed better practices, tended to spread rather than contain fires. The disparity extended to air groups. Essex-class carriers operated the F-6F Hellcat, a fighter specifically designed to counter the Zero. Powered by a 2,000 horsepower radial engine, heavily armored, capable of absorbing battle damage and continuing to fight, the Hellcat represented American design philosophy applied to aircraft. The Zero, lightweight and maneuverable but fragile, had dominated the early war when flown by veteran pilots. By 1944, most of those veterans were dead. and the inexperienced replacement pilots found the Zero's advantages negated by American firepower and durability. American torpedo bombers, the TBF Avenger, were similarly robust. Japanese torpedo bombers, still primarily the Nakajima B-5N-Kate, were obsolete by 1944 standards. The dive bombers told the same story. American SB-2C Helldivers, though troubled by mechanical issues, delivered heavier bomb loads than the aging HED-3A Val. But the crucial advantage remained the carriers themselves, the platforms that delivered air power to the battle space, and the Americans possessed those platforms in overwhelming numbers. Commander Shibata, standing on Zuikaku's bridge in June 1944, understood what the count of 24 American carriers meant. It meant that the decisive battle, when it came, would not be decisive in the way Japanese doctrine had envisioned. There would be no single engagement that permanently shifted the balance. The Americans could afford to lose carriers. They could accept damage to 3 or 4 ships, withdraw them for repair, and replace them with fresh hulls arriving from shipyards at a rate Japan could never match. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, about to unfold on this clear morning, would prove his assessment correct. Admiral Ozawa commanded 9 carriers: Taiho, the new fleet carrier; Shokaku and Zuikaku, the Pearl Harbor veterans; Junyo, Hio, and the light carriers Ryuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. Against 15 American fleet carriers and 9 light carriers, the disparity in aircraft was even more severe. Japanese carriers embarked 437 aircraft total. American Task Force 58 operated 895 carrier aircraft, plus additional float planes on battleships and cruisers. But numbers alone did not capture the full reality. The American carriers operated as an integrated system. Advanced radar provided early warning. The new proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, a technical achievement Japan had not matched, created defensive fields that Japanese aircraft could barely penetrate. Fighter directors aboard the carriers coordinated defensive patrols with a precision that turned airspace into kill zones. Most critically, American pilot training programs had scaled to match production. In June 1944, the U.S. Navy had 47,000 trained aviators for 34,000 aircraft. Losses could be immediately replaced. Veteran pilots rotated home to train new squadrons, spreading combat experience through the entire force. Japan had no equivalent system. Pilot training, which had always required 2 years to produce carrier-qualified aviators, had not been compressed or accelerated. The veterans lost at Coral Sea, Midway, and in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaigns could not be replaced at anything approaching the loss rate. The result was catastrophically visible on June 19th. The air battle that American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot demonstrated the accumulated advantages of American systems over Japanese heroism. Japanese air strikes launched in 4 waves against Task Force 58. Advanced American radar detected them at distance. F-6F Hellcats, directed by fighter controllers who could track every aircraft in a 300-mile radius, intercepted the strikes while they were still 60 miles from the carriers. The engagement was one-sided to a degree that shocked even the Americans. Of the first wave's 69 aircraft, the Americans shot down 42. The second wave lost 98 of 130 aircraft. The third wave, 79 of 47 aircraft. The fourth wave lost 73 of 82 aircraft. By the day's end, Japan had lost 315 carrier aircraft. American losses totaled 29 aircraft in air combat. The mathematical disparity revealed not just better aircraft or better pilots, though both were true. It revealed the culmination of systematic American advantages built into every level of naval operations. The carriers that could produce more sorties, the radar that provided earlier warning, the fighter direction systems that maximized defensive efficiency, the proximity-fused shells that multiplied anti-aircraft effectiveness, the industrial base that could replace losses overnight, and undergirding everything, the shipyards that built carriers faster than Japan could produce aircraft to fill them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The day after the Turkey Shoot, American submarines sank 2 Japanese carriers, Taiho and Zuikaku. American carrier aircraft sank a third, Hio. In 48 hours, Japan lost 3 fleet carriers and 600 aircraft. The mobile fleet withdrew, no longer capable of challenging American naval aviation. The strategic significance transcended the immediate tactical results. The Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the moment when numerical superiority became overwhelming dominance. Japan still possessed carriers. Zuikaku would survive until October. Several light carriers remained operational, but the mobile fleet as a coherent striking force capable of contesting American carrier task forces had ceased to exist. The destruction of Japanese carrier aviation at Philippine Sea forced a fundamental reassessment of Japanese naval strategy. The assumptions that had driven operational planning since 1941, the belief that courage and tactical skill could offset material disadvantages, the conviction that one decisive battle could alter the war's trajectory, all required abandonment. What replaced those assumptions was something closer to despair, dressed in operational orders. Vice Admiral Ugaki Matome, Chief of Staff to Admiral Toyoda, wrote in his diary on June 21, 1944, the day after the battle concluded, "The enemy possesses such overwhelming strength in carriers that our calculations no longer have meaning. We counted 8 carriers at Midway. Now they deploy 24 in a single operation, with more in reserve. Even if we sink 6 or 8 through some miracle of fortune, they will replace them before we can exploit any advantage." The diary entry, recovered after the war, captured the psychological impact of American production. Japanese naval officers had trained to think in terms of balanced forces, careful calculations of relative strength, tactical maneuvers that could amplify advantages or minimize disadvantages. The carrier ratio they now faced exceeded anything doctrine had contemplated. American carrier production had not merely matched Japanese estimates, it had obliterated them. The final figures, compiled as ships commissioned through 1945, demonstrated industrial mobilization that belonged in a different category from traditional naval expansion. The United States Navy ordered 32 Essex-class carriers between July 1940 and June 1943. Construction began on 26 hulls. 2 were cancelled while under construction, their partially complete hulls scrapped. 24 were delivered to the fleet between December 1942 and April 1946. 18 Essex-class carriers achieved operational status during World War II. 14 saw combat in the Pacific Theater. Every major American offensive from late 1943 onward included multiple Essex-class carriers as the core striking force. The construction timeline defied every precedent in capital shipbuilding. USS Essex, keel laid April 28, 1941, commissioned December 31, 1942, 20 months. USS Yorktown, keel laid December 1, 1941, commissioned April 15, 1943, 16 and a half months. USS Franklin held the record. Keel laid December 7, 1942, the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor, commissioned January 31, 1944. 14 months from cutting steel to combat-ready carrier. The Navy awarded contracts to 4 separate shipyards to maximize production. Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Virginia. Bethlehem Steel's Fall River Shipyard in Massachusetts. Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York. Philadelphia Navy Yard in Pennsylvania. Norfolk Navy Yard in Virginia. Each yard built multiple carriers simultaneously, with construction schedules staggered to deliver new hulls every 60 days. The shipyards employed tactics borrowed from automobile manufacturing, standardized components fabricated off-site, modular construction that allowed parallel work on different sections, 3-shift operations that kept the building ways active 24 hours per day, women performing skilled machining and welding operations previously restricted to men. At Newport News, the workforce peaked at over 37,000 employees. Women comprised approximately 35% of skilled workers. Each Essex-class carrier required approximately 3 million man-hours of labor to complete. The shipyards reduced this progressively through learning and process refinement. USS Intrepid, the fourth Essex-class carrier completed, required 22% fewer man-hours than Essex, despite being a more complex ship with additional anti-aircraft weapons. The Navy's decision to standardize the design proved crucial. Rather than pursuing incremental improvements that would require retooling, the Essex-class maintained the same basic layout across all units. Modifications were limited to weapons systems, radar equipment, and minor improvements like the clipper bow introduced in March 1943. This allowed shipyards to refine construction techniques without needing to accommodate major design changes. The components themselves revealed American industrial depth. Each carrier required 4 steam turbines, combined output 150,000, shaft horsepower, 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, miles of electrical wiring, thousands of individual equipment items from fire pumps to optical rangefinders. The supply chain supporting carrier construction involved hundreds of subcontractors across multiple states. Crucially, this industrial mobilization occurred while American shipyards simultaneously produced escort carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, amphibious vessels, and support ships. The Essex program did not consume all available capacity. It represented one component of a naval expansion that saw the United States commission 644 major warships and submarines between December 1941 and August 1945. Japan managed to commission 165 major warships and submarines in the same period, a 4-to-1 disparity that understated the real imbalance, since American ships averaged larger displacement and more sophisticated equipment. The carrier ratio told the story most clearly. From December 1941 through August 1945, the United States commissioned 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and 77 escort carriers. 110 carriers total. Japan commissioned 17 carriers of all types during the same period. 8 entered fleet service. 9 served only in training or transport roles. The disparity in carrier aviation told a parallel story. American aircraft production for carrier operations exceeded Japanese output by margins that resembled the shipbuilding advantage. Grumman produced 12,500 Hellcat fighters. Douglas delivered over 5,000 Dauntless dive bombers, replaced by the Helldiver. General Motors built nearly 10,000 Avenger torpedo bombers. Japanese carrier aircraft production peaked in 1943 at approximately 3,000 units annually, then declined as strategic bombing disrupted factories and raw material shortages constrained output. By 1944, Japanese factories were producing fewer than 2,000 carrier-capable aircraft per year. American factories produced 15,000, but production numbers captured only part of the advantage. American logistics ensured that aircraft reached the carriers, that spare parts remained available, that ammunition and fuel arrived in quantities sufficient for sustained operations. The fleet train, the unglamorous support vessels that kept the fast carriers supplied, represented organizational sophistication Japan never matched. Each Essex-class carrier, operating at full tempo, consumed approximately 40,000 gallons of aviation fuel per day, required hundreds of replacement aircraft tires monthly, needed machine shop support to maintain aircraft engines and systems. Ammunition expenditure during intense operations could exceed 1,000 rounds per day across all aircraft. The logistics system that supported these requirements stretched from the United States mainland across 6,000 miles of ocean to forward bases in the Pacific. Fleet oilers refueled carriers at sea. Ammunition ships delivered bombs and ammunition. Stores ships brought everything from aircraft parts to fresh food. Repair ships provided floating maintenance facilities. Task Force 58, operating during the Marianas campaign, included not just the combat vessels, but a support train of 41 fleet oilers, 11 escort carriers carrying replacement aircraft, ammunition ships, provisions ships, and repair vessels. The entire force operated as an integrated system that could remain at sea for weeks without touching land. Japan never developed an equivalent capability. Japanese carriers operating far from base facilities quickly exhausted supplies. Damaged aircraft that could not be repaired aboard ship had to be jettisoned. Fuel constraints limited sortie rates. The inability to maintain combat tempo meant that even when Japanese carriers remained afloat, their operational effectiveness degraded within days of reaching a combat zone. The industrial and logistical advantages compounded during extended campaigns. American carriers damaged in battle withdrew for repair. Their air groups transferred to replacement carriers arriving from Pearl Harbor. Japanese carriers damaged in battle often could not reach repair facilities, or if they did, faced month-long waits for dry dock space while shipyards prioritized destroyers and submarines. USS Enterprise, damaged multiple times during 1942 and 43, always returned to service within weeks, or at most a few months. Zuikaku, damaged at Coral Sea in May 1942, did not return to full operational status until July. Shokaku, heavily damaged at Coral Sea, required repairs that lasted until March 1943. The tempo of American carrier operations increased progressively as more Essex-class hulls entered service. In 1942, American carriers in the Pacific conducted intermittent raids, withdrawing to Pearl Harbor between operations. By late 1943, with 6 Essex-class carriers operational, task forces remained continuously at sea, rotating individual carriers for resupply, but maintaining constant pressure on Japanese positions. By mid-1944, American carrier task forces operated as self-sustaining formations, capable of supporting amphibious operations for months, while simultaneously conducting deep strikes hundreds of miles from the landing beaches. The Marianas operation, from June through August 1944, saw American carriers continuously engaged without returning to Pearl Harbor. Japanese naval aviation, reduced to a defensive posture after Philippine Sea, attempted to compensate through land-based air power. The strategy required dispersing aircraft to forward bases throughout the Pacific, where they could intercept American task forces approaching invasion targets. The strategy failed for the same reason carrier aviation had failed. American production overwhelmed Japanese deployments. For every airfield Japan reinforced, American carrier strikes destroyed aircraft faster than replacements arrived. The cycle repeated across the Pacific. Truk, Palau, the Philippines, Formosa. Each base received reinforcements. Each base saw those reinforcements annihilated by carrier airstrikes. The October 1944 Battle of Leyte Gulf represented Japan's final attempt to employ carriers in a decisive engagement. Admiral Ozawa commanded the Northern Force, built around 4 carriers, Zuikaku, the last Pearl Harbor survivor, the light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. The force embarked only 108 aircraft total. The carriers had been stripped of most air groups to create land-based formations. Ozawa's mission was not to win a carrier battle. It was to serve as bait. Draw the American, fast carriers north while Japanese battleships attacked the invasion fleet at Leyte. The plan assumed American commanders would instinctively pursue carriers if offered the opportunity. The assumption proved correct. Admiral Halsey, commanding 3rd Fleet, took the bait. Task Force 38, now the designation for the fast carriers under Halsey rather than Spruance, pursued Ozawa north. On October 25th, American carrier aircraft sank all 4 Japanese carriers. Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, the Eastern Solomons, the Santa Cruz Islands, and Philippine Sea, went down under waves of American bombs and torpedoes. The last of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor vanished beneath the Philippine Sea 3 years and 10 months after that raid. With her sinking, the continuous operational history of Japanese fleet carriers that had begun in the 1920s reached its end. Japan still possessed carriers. On paper, technically, the carrier, Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull after Midway, commissioned November 19, 1944. At 72,000 tons full load displacement, she was the largest aircraft carrier yet built. The conversion had been rushed. The ship sailed for Kure Naval Base to complete fitting out on November 28, 10 days after commissioning. The submarine USS Archerfish intercepted Shinano in the early morning hours of November 29. 4 torpedoes struck the carrier's starboard side. The damage was severe but should have been manageable for a ship designed to withstand such punishment. But Shinano had not completed sea trials. Her damage control crews were inexperienced. Watertight doors had not been properly tested. 7 hours after the torpedo hits, the largest aircraft carrier in the world capsized and sank. She had been in commission for 10 days. She never launched or recovered a single aircraft operationally. Her sinking represented the ultimate expression of Japan's inability to translate industrial effort into combat capability. Even when Japanese shipyards completed a vessel, the supporting systems needed to make it combat effective did not exist. The final Japanese carrier operations came in early 1945 during the Okinawa campaign. Carriers Amaji, Katsuragi, and others remained in Japanese waters, unable to sortie due to fuel shortages and the absence of trained air groups. They served as targets for American carrier strikes, damaged but not sunk, military assets that consumed resources without producing combat power. By August 1945, Japan possessed approximately 8 carriers in various states of operational readiness. None carried meaningful air groups. None had fuel sufficient for extended operations. None posed a threat to American naval forces. The United States, by August 1945, had 28 fleet carriers in commission, 17 Essex-class carriers, 3 Midway-class carriers, enlarged versions displacing 45,000 tons, commissioned in the war's final months, 8 light carriers, plus dozens of escort carriers supporting amphibious operations and anti-submarine warfare. The carrier ratio that had started the war at 6 Japanese to 3 American had inverted to 8 American for every operational Japanese carrier. Except the ratio understated reality because Japanese carriers no longer operated. They existed. They occupied space in harbours. They appeared on organizational charts, but they did not project power. The Essex-class had fulfilled its design purpose completely: provide the striking power necessary to advance across the Pacific, absorb battle damage while remaining operational, maintain tempo through continuous operations, and deliver overwhelming air superiority that made invasion possible. 14 Essex-class carriers earned battle stars during World War II. USS Essex received 13. USS Enterprise, though not an Essex-class ship, earned 20, the most decorated ship in American naval history. But the Essex-class collectively earned the war, not through individual heroism, though that existed in abundance, but through systematic application of industrial power that rendered enemy resistance mathematically futile. Commander Shibata did not survive the war. Zuikaku sank at Leyte Gulf with heavy loss of life. His diary, recovered from his quarters at Kure Naval Base, was translated by American intelligence in 1946. The final entry, dated October 20th, 1944, 5 days before Zuikaku's loss, contained one paragraph that translators marked as significant. "We sail tomorrow knowing the mission is suicide dressed as strategy. The carriers we face are too numerous to count with accuracy. Each one we sink will be replaced before we can exploit any advantage. Each aircraft we destroy will be replaced overnight. The Americans have built a system that makes individual courage meaningless. We have slogans about spirit overcoming material. They have shipyards that build carriers in 14 months. The outcome has never been in doubt since we failed to sink their carriers at Pearl Harbor. We simply refused to accept what the mathematics always indicated." The mathematics were indeed stark. Japan entered the war with 11 carriers and completed 17 more during the conflict, 28 total. 14 were lost to enemy action. By war's end, Japan's carrier force was effectively non-existent as a combat arm. The United States entered the war with 7 carriers and completed 110 more during the conflict, 117 total. 11 were lost to enemy action. By war's end, American carrier forces dominated the Pacific absolutely. The ratio of production, 17 Japanese carriers to 110 American, captured the industrial imbalance that determined the Pacific War's outcome. Japan could not match American production in any major category. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, aircraft, tanks, trucks, ammunition. Every metric showed similar disparities. But carriers, more than any other weapon system, determined the war's trajectory. Control of the seas required command of the air above those seas. Carriers provided that command. The nation that could build carriers faster, operate them more effectively, and sustain them logistically controlled the Pacific. The Essex-class program cost approximately $8 billion in 1945 currency, equivalent to roughly $120 billion in modern terms. 24 carriers, at an average cost of $300 million each, plus the supporting infrastructure of shipyards, training facilities, supply networks, and escort vessels. The investment delivered strategic dominance. From late 1943 onward, every major American amphibious operation proceeded under the protection of multiple Essex-class carriers: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Truk, the Marianas, Peleliu, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each landing was supported by fast carrier task forces that could deliver more sorties in a single day than Japan's entire remaining carrier force could launch in a week. The carriers also enabled the final strategic bombing campaign against Japan. By securing the Marianas, carrier forces made possible the construction of airfields that brought Japan within range of B-29 bombers. The bombers that burned Japanese cities and dropped atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew from bases that carriers had made possible by establishing air supremacy. The broader lesson extended beyond World War II. The Essex-class program demonstrated that modern industrial war rewarded systematic planning and mass production over individual excellence. Japanese carriers had been magnificently designed. Japanese pilots, in the war's early years, had been superbly trained. Japanese doctrine had been sophisticated and aggressive. None of it mattered against an opponent that could produce ships at 10 times the rate, replace losses overnight, and sustain operations indefinitely through superior logistics. The human cost bore noting as well. Approximately 10,000 American sailors died serving aboard Essex-class carriers during World War II. Deaths from kamikaze attacks, battle damage, operational accidents, and disease. USS Franklin alone lost over 800 men when she was hit by Japanese bombs off Kyushu in March 1945. USS Bunker Hill lost nearly 400 men to kamikaze attacks in May 1945. But the carriers kept operating. Franklin made it back to Pearl Harbor under her own power despite catastrophic damage. Bunker Hill reached Ulithi for emergency repairs. Both eventually sailed back to the United States for reconstruction. The industrial system that built the carriers also supported their survival through damage control, systems, firefighting equipment, and redundant engineering spaces that kept ships afloat even after devastating hits. Japanese carrier losses typically resulted in total losses. When a Japanese carrier was hit, it usually sank. Shokaku, Taiho, Hio, Zuikaku, Chitose, Chiyoda, all sank after battle damage. The few that survived, like Junyo damaged in 1944, spent months in repair and never fully recovered combat effectiveness. The disparity reflected design philosophy. American carriers built to survive. Japanese carriers built to strike. In extended warfare, survival mattered more than initial striking power. 4 Essex-class carriers survive today as museum ships: USS Yorktown in South Carolina, USS Intrepid in New York, USS Hornet in California, USS Lexington in Texas. Visitors can walk the flight decks, see the hangar bays, visit the ready rooms where pilots received briefings before missions. The ships stand as monuments to industrial mobilization and systematic warfare. They also serve as reminders of strategic decisions made before the war began. Japan chose to initiate conflict with a nation that possessed 10 times its industrial capacity. The attack on Pearl Harbor was tactically brilliant and strategically catastrophic. It unified American public opinion, ensured unlimited industrial mobilization, and began a conflict Japan could not win through any combination of tactical skill and operational excellence. The carrier count that Commander Shibata recorded in June 1944, 24 American carriers against 9 Japanese, told the essential story of the Pacific War. One side had systems that could build carriers in 14 months and operate them continuously across thousands of miles of ocean. The other side had courage and doctrine designed for a different kind of war. In modern industrial conflict, systems defeat courage every time. The Essex-class proved that decisively. 24 carriers built in 4 years. 110 total American carriers of all types, against 17 Japanese carriers completed during the entire war. The mathematics were never in doubt once American shipyards began full production. Japan entered the war, counting 8 American carriers. America built 141 more in 36 months. That disparity, more than any battle, determined who would control the Pacific. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.